Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The morning train from London arrived at Ashford Station precisely at 10:30, a punctuality that pleased Hercule Poirot immensely. Everything, he believed, should operate with the precision of a well-wound chronometer. The small village of Ashford in the Water, nestled in the rolling Cotswolds, appeared to embody this very principle. Thatched cottages clustered along High Street. The ancient church, its spire pointing toward an overcast October sky, dominated the landscape, and the great limestone manor house overlooking the valley stood sentinel, as if guarding the tranquility of centuries. Poirot descended from the carriage with deliberate grace, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the morning's damp. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a carefully waxed moustache of heroic proportions and eyes that missed nothing. The porter hurried to assist with his luggage, several cases of impressive quality, while the Belgian detective took in his surroundings with methodical observation. It was Chief Inspector Japp's telegram that had summoned him here. The Scotland Yard inspector, though sometimes frustrated by Poirot's methods, held the Belgian's talents in high regard. The wire had been terse. Murder at Ashford Manor. Lord Pemberton deceased. Circumstances peculiar. Your expertise requested. Japp. The local constabulary had arranged modest lodgings at the Crown Inn, an establishment of respectable vintage that boasted a polished bar of dark oak, mullioned windows, and the sort of oppressive quiet that seemed to characterize English provincial life. Poirot had learned that quiet often masked depths of human complication. He had scarcely settled into his room when a knock came at the door. Chief Inspector Japp himself, a solid man of middle years, with the methodical bearing of a career policeman, entered with a faint expression of relief. "Poirot, by Jove, I'm glad you've come," Japp began, positioning himself near the fireplace. "This business is damnable. Lord Pemberton found dead in his study Tuesday evening. The household is in an uproar, and I confess the surface explanations don't sit right with me." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot replied, gesturing to a chair. "Tell me everything. The smallest details, if you please. I have found that policemen often discard the very fragments that prove most illuminating." Japp settled himself with a grunt. Lord Pemberton was 63, wealthy, and by all accounts in excellent health. No serious enemies that we could discover. Tuesday evening, his butler, Mr. Graves, took him tea at 5 o'clock. At 7, when dinner was being prepared, Lord Pemberton failed to ring for his evening ablutions. Graves went to the study and found him slumped in his leather chair, quite dead. The cause? Poirot's fingers formed a precise pyramid beneath his chin. That's the peculiarity. On the surface, it appeared to be a sudden seizure of the heart. The body was warm. He hadn't been dead more than an hour or so. But the physician, Dr. Hartwell, noticed something odd. A faint smell on his breath. Slightly bitter, almost almond-like. Hartwell suspected poisoning but couldn't be certain. The contents of the study were undisturbed. There was no sign of violence or disturbance. And here's the strangest part. On his desk, beneath his very hand, was a note. A note? Poirot leaned forward. What did this note convey? Japp produced a folded paper from his waistcoat pocket. It reads, "Payment for sins. The first account is settled. A.R." Poirot took the note carefully, examining it with a jeweller's precision. The handwriting was angular, educated, written in blue ink. The paper was common stock, of no particular distinction. This AR is mysterious, and the phrasing, the first account, suggests there may be others. That was my thought precisely, Japp confirmed, which is why I sent for you immediately. Over the following hour, Poirot extracted from Japp a comprehensive account of Lord Pemberton's household. There was his wife, Lady Pemberton, a woman of 55, refined and composed. Their only child, a daughter named Margaret, now 28 and unmarried. Then came the household staff. Graves the butler, in service for 15 years. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the housekeeper who had worked at the manor for 20 years. And various servants of respectable tenure. But Japp also revealed that Lord Pemberton kept his own counsel regarding personal matters. He was, by reputation, strict in his adherence to certain principles. A man of the old school, particular about propriety, finances, and conduct. There is something more, Japp said, his expression darkening. Lord Pemberton had made alterations to his will only last month. The local solicitor, Mr. Hartley, confirmed as much. But the contents of the new will remain sealed. Lord Pemberton stipulated that it not be opened until certain matters were clarified. Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the village street below. The afternoon light was beginning to fail, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. "We must observe Ashford Manor," he said quietly. "We must examine not merely what is apparent, but what lies beneath. A man does not write the first account is settled without foreshadowing others. Tell me, Inspector, when Lord Pemberton altered his will, did no one remark upon his state of mind? Lady Pemberton noticed he seemed troubled, though he would not explain why. His daughter Margaret appeared anxious as well, though one cannot always read young women's thoughts." Poirot turned from the window, his dark eyes alight with interest. "Then we begin tomorrow at the manor. But tonight, Inspector, I should like to examine the body, and we must review the correspondence of Lord Pemberton from the past 6 months. Somewhere in those papers, I suspect, lies the beginning of our mystery." The morning broke clear and cold, with frost glittering upon the manor's extensive lawns. Poirot and Japp were received by Lady Pemberton in the morning-room, a chamber decorated in pale greens and golds, suggesting both taste and wealth. She was dressed in the severe black of mourning, her posture rigid, her manner courteous but distant. "We are very sorry for your loss, madame," Poirot began, his formality matching her own. "It is our duty to ask certain questions, however delicate the circumstances may be." Lady Pemberton nodded slightly. "I understand, Monsieur Poirot. I have read of your work. You will forgive me if I am somewhat composed. My husband and I had been married for 30 years. One learns to prepare oneself for the inevitable." The remark was curious in its phrasing. One would not typically prepare for a sudden death. Yet Lady Pemberton seemed almost to have anticipated something. "Your husband received a note," Poirot ventured, observing her reaction. "A note discovered clutched in his hand. Did he mention to you any anxiety regarding his safety? Any fears?" Lady Pemberton's eyes remained fixed upon the small table before her, where a china cup sat untouched. "My husband was a man of principle, Monsieur Poirot. He believed in justice, in the proper ordering of society. He had, in recent weeks, become troubled by certain matters, but he did not confide in me regarding their specifics. He was a private man, and the alteration of his will, this also concerned a matter of principle." A faint tremor crossed Lady Pemberton's composure. "My husband believed that those responsible for wrongdoing should face the consequences of their actions. If he changed his will, it was because he had discovered something that required rectification." after further questioning, yielded little of consequence. Poirot was shown to the study where Lord Pemberton had spent his final hours. It was a room of considerable character. Mahogany wainscoting, shelves laden with leather-bound volumes, and a fireplace of impressive proportions. The leather chair in which the deceased had been found occupied a position of prominence before the hearth. Poirot sat in the chair, assuming the pose in which Lord Pemberton's body had been discovered. The windows were locked, he inquired. From the inside, Japp confirmed. And the door was closed but not locked when Graves entered. So the murderer had access to the household, Poirot observed. Not an intruder, but someone accepted within these walls. Poirot rose and examined the desk with meticulous care. Writing implements of good quality, several books on estate management, correspondence arranged in orderly files. One drawer, slightly ajar, contained what appeared to be personal papers. He withdrew them carefully. Letters, he murmured. 6 letters posted from London over the past 2 months, all from the same correspondent, indicated by the handwriting, all marked personal, written upon envelopes of quality paper. The letters, however, had been burned. Merely ash remained in the fireplace, though Poirot could discern fragments suggesting they had been destroyed recently. He received threatening correspondence and then burned it, Poirot concluded. Why? For fear of incriminating others, or to protect someone's reputation. The initials on the note AR, Japp said. We've been attempting to identify who might bear those initials among the household and immediate circle. The note itself, Poirot said, retrieving it once more, was written after Lord Pemberton's death. Observe, the hand is steady, the ink unsmudged. It was placed beneath his hand by the murderer, as a signature, as a proclamation. AR wishes us to understand that the death was intentional, even justified in some distorted moral calculus. But what poison was used? Japp pressed. Hartwell mentioned the almond scent. Cyanide, perhaps? Possibly, Poirot allowed, but I should like to examine the contents of Lord Pemberton's stomach and the tissues thoroughly. A quantity of poison must have been administered, in his tea perhaps, or dissolved in the brandy. An examination of the study's various drinking vessels proved illuminating. A decanter of brandy sat upon a side table nearly full. The snifter used by Lord Pemberton was similarly positioned, with only a residue remaining. More importantly, in the tea service left by Graves, the pot contained cold tea. But the cup was most revealing. Poirot held it to his nostrils and inhaled delicately. A faint sweetness, he murmured, disguised but present. Here is where the poison was administered. Someone knew that Lord Pemberton took his afternoon tea at precisely 5 o'clock. Someone familiar with his habits. Someone with access to the kitchen. They proceeded to interview the household staff. Graves, the butler, was a man of perhaps 60, with the distinguished bearing of his profession. He confirmed the timing of events with precision, and seemed genuinely shaken by Lord Pemberton's death. I have served the family for 15 years, he said with evident distress. His lordship was a fair and just employer. I cannot imagine who would wish to harm him. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 55, with sharp features and the efficient manner of someone who has spent a lifetime maintaining order. Her answers were direct and unadorned. The kitchen staff prepared the tea, she stated. Mary, the parlour maid, carried it to the study at 5 o'clock, as she has done every day for 3 years. No one else had access to the service once it left the kitchen. Margaret Pemberton, the daughter, was more difficult to assess. She was an attractive young woman, dark-haired like her father, with a nervous habit of twisting her handkerchief. When questioned about her father's recent state of mind, she was evasive. "Father seemed preoccupied," she said quietly. "But he had always been so. Business matters, I suppose. He did not mention any specific anxieties. Any sense of danger?" Margaret's eyes flickered with something. "Fear? Guilt? Uncertainty?" "No, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I thought he seemed afraid of something these past weeks. He would start at unexpected sounds and seemed always to be watching the post." "Did he receive letters that disturbed him?" "Yes," Margaret admitted. "I saw him in the garden once, burning letters. He seemed angry, but also sad." That afternoon, Poirot asked to meet with Mary, the parlour-maid. She was a girl of perhaps 18, plain-featured but intelligent-eyed. When questioned about the preparation of tea, she was forthcoming. "I prepared the tray myself, sir," she said. Mrs. Ashford supervised. The kettle was boiled fresh. The tea was measured from the caddy in the pantry, and the service was taken directly to the study. I saw no one interfere with it. "And the sugar? The milk?" "Added by Lord Pemberton himself, sir. He preferred his tea very particular. 2 lumps of sugar, milk from the jug that is kept in the study." Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp. The milk jug. Of course. Poison in the milk jug. A method that would require neither disturbance of the tea service nor interference in the kitchen. Anyone with access to the study at any point during the day could have poisoned it. As evening settled over Ashford Manor, Poirot stood once more in the study, gazing at the chair where death had claimed Lord Pemberton. The fire burned brightly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The room felt oppressive, weighted with secrets. "The murderer is clever," Poirot mused to himself. "Clever, yet theatrical. The note is not mere coincidence. It is a signature, a statement. AI wishes to be known, yet not known. Wishes to claim responsibility, yet remain hidden. This is psychology of the most interesting variety." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in Ashford Manor, a murderer walked freely, secure in the belief that their crime would go undetected. Poirot smiled slightly. They would soon discover the error of such confidence. Over the following days, Poirot undertook a systematic examination of every aspect of Lord Pemberton's life. He requested access to the household account books, the servant schedules, the post register, and any correspondence that had not been destroyed. He questioned the various staff members with patient persistence, asking seemingly trivial questions about their daily routines, their observations, their relationships with one another. It was during this process that certain peculiarities began to emerge. The first concerned a visitor who had called upon Lord Pemberton some 3 weeks prior. None of the household staff could clearly recall his appearance, though all remembered his visit. He had been admitted to the study directly, and the meeting had lasted approximately 2 hours. Lord Pemberton had dismissed the staff afterward, and had spent the remainder of the evening in evident distress. A gentleman of perhaps 50 years, Graves recalled hesitantly. Well-dressed. He travelled by private motor car. But I'm afraid I cannot describe his features with certainty, sir. There was something about him that one did not memorize. The second peculiarity concerned Miss Margaret Pemberton's engagement. Lady Pemberton reluctantly revealed that her daughter had been engaged to marry a young man named Henry Ashford, a distant cousin of the housekeeper, and a man of modest means and questionable reputation. Lord Pemberton had expressly forbidden the match some 6 weeks prior, leading to considerable tension within the household. He was most adamant, Lady Pemberton said quietly. He said that Henry Ashford was unsuitable in every particular, and that Margaret would do well to consider marriage to someone else. They quarrelled quite bitterly. I had not realized how serious the disagreement was until recently. The third peculiarity was most revealing. During his examination of the study's contents, Poirot discovered, hidden behind a volume of Shakespeare, a small leather journal. Its pages contained brief entries in Lord Pemberton's precise handwriting, dating back approximately 6 months. Many entries were cryptic, but certain passages proved illuminating. June 15th. Letter received today. The shock is profound. How could I have been so blind? Must investigate further before taking action. July 2nd. Evidence confirms the worst. A question of morality now. Shall I act? What are my obligations? August 10th. The decision is made. Justice must be served, but carefully. Others depend upon my discretion. September 22nd. Another letter. This one confirms my suspicions regarding the second matter. The pattern is undeniable. I must act now, though the consequences will be profound. October 1st. I have written to solicitor regarding will. It is necessary to take certain precautions. Once this business is concluded, I may finally rest. The entries told a story of a man struggling with knowledge that had placed him in a moral position of considerable complexity. He had discovered something, perhaps multiple somethings, that had shocked him and forced him to make decisions that he clearly found burdensome. Poirot brought the journal to Japp's attention. "Your Lord Pemberton," he said, "was not a man of simple virtue, but rather a man of principle, attempting to navigate complex moral waters. He had discovered wrongdoing, had gathered evidence, and was preparing to expose it. But he was also a man of discretion. Notice how he mentions obligations and obligations to others. He was protecting someone, even as he sought justice for the injured party. But how does this help us identify AR? Japp asked with some frustration. AR is someone whom Lord Pemberton has wronged, Poirot replied. Someone whom he intended to expose or who feared such exposure. The note, payment for sins, suggests a moral judgment. The murderer believes Lord Pemberton deserved to die. It was at this point that Poirot decided to examine more closely the finances of Lord Pemberton's immediate circle. With the solicitor's assistance and the authority of Scotland Yard, financial records were obtained for Margaret Pemberton and for Henry Ashford. What emerged was striking. Henry Ashford was deeply in debt, remarkably deep. Gambling debts, unpaid loans, and what appeared to be the remnants of a rather dissolute lifestyle. Margaret, for her part, had recently come into a modest inheritance from a great-aunt, some £2,000, which she had apparently made available to her fiancé. The young man is in financial straits, Poirot observed. The engagement to Miss Margaret is, in a sense, financial salvation for him. When Lord Pemberton forbade the match, Mr. Henry Ashford's circumstances became suddenly desperate. He might even face legal proceedings for debt. Surely you don't suspect the boy, Japp protested. He's barely 30 and has no apparent motive for killing Lord Pemberton beyond anger at a broken engagement. The absence of an apparent motive is often the most suspicious circumstance, Poirot replied. But no, I do not yet accuse the young man. However, we must consider that AR might be an accomplice. There may be 2 persons involved in this crime, not one. It was then that Poirot requested permission to examine Lord Pemberton's correspondence with his solicitor. The letters were remarkably illuminating. Over the past 3 months, Lord Pemberton had been making inquiries regarding the possibility of altering his will, of establishing certain trusts, and of creating provisions for the future care of someone unnamed, referred to only as the injured party. Most intriguingly, in a letter dated September 28th, Lord Pemberton had written, I confess my uncertainty regarding the proper course. If I am correct in my suspicions, then justice demands action. Yet such action would cause profound pain to innocents. I am wrestling with the decision of whether my duty lies with law or with mercy. The solicitor, Mr. Hartley, a man of perhaps 60 with the cautious manner of his profession, proved unwilling to divulge the specifics of Lord Pemberton's intentions. A man's solicitor is bound by privilege, he said firmly. I cannot discuss the contents of Lord Pemberton's will or the nature of his inquiries, even with Scotland Yard. However, Poirot observed something that Japp did not. Mr. Hartley's hands trembled slightly when discussing the will, and his eyes flickered with something that suggested knowledge he was reluctant to possess. More importantly, when questioned about whether Lord Pemberton had received any documents or letters specifically requesting that they be kept confidential, Mr. Hartley hesitated just a moment too long before answering in the negative. That evening, Poirot sat in his room at the Crown Inn, smoking a contemplative pipe. He had established a working theory, though it remained incomplete. A complex pattern was emerging, one involving financial desperation, moral obligation, and hidden secrets. What we require now, he murmured to himself, is a second event. Criminals do not typically cease their activities after one success. If the murderer is driven by what they perceive as righteous justice, they will inevitably strike again. The question is only when and whom they shall target next. He reviewed his notes one final time before retiring. 6 suspects of genuine interest. Henry Ashford, desperate for funds. Margaret Pemberton, emotionally distressed by her father's opposition to her engagement. Lady Pemberton, composed to the point of seeming unnatural. Eleanor Ashford, the housekeeper with a mysterious family connection to Henry Ashford. Mr. Hartley, the solicitor, bearing knowledge he wished to conceal. And the mysterious visitor who had called 3 weeks prior, and whose appearance no one could adequately describe. The initials AR continued to elude identification. Eleanor Ashford fit the initials perfectly. But what motive could she possess? Henry Ashford possessed initials entirely different. Poirot lay in bed, the October wind whistling through the eaves of the old inn, and waited for the next act in this drama of death and secrets to unfold. The atmosphere in Ashford began to shift tangibly in the days following Lord Pemberton's funeral. The village had been shocked by his death, but shock had begun to curdle into suspicion. If poison was the cause, and the whispers in the village suggested as much, then who among them could have administered it? The servants at the manor began to eye one another with increased wariness. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones about the Pemberton household, and the family itself seemed to fracture under the pressure of uncertainty. Poirot observed Margaret Pemberton's deteriorating condition with particular interest. She had become more nervous, less composed. She avoided her mother's company and seemed to start at unexpected sounds. When Poirot encountered her in the manor's library one afternoon, she appeared near tears. "Miss Pemberton," he said gently, "you bear the weight of considerable anxiety. Perhaps it would be salutary to unburden yourself." Margaret hesitated, then said quietly, "My father and I quarrelled, Monsieur Poirot, about Henry. After he died, I felt guilty. What if my distress hastened his death? What if my unhappiness contributed to his demise? You believe you bear responsibility for his murder?" Poirot asked gently. "Not responsibility," Margaret said quickly, "but I fear that my actions somehow precipitated his death. Then I would urge you to consider this. A father's love often manifests as prohibition. He forbade your marriage not from cruelty, but from conviction that the match would bring you sorrow. Have you considered that your father may have discovered something about Mr. Henry Ashford that he found deeply troubling?" Margaret's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "Only that parents do not always explain their motivations. Your father may have possessed knowledge that justified his opposition." Lady Pemberton, meanwhile, had begun to display curious behaviour of her own. She received frequent telephone calls from an unknown caller, always requesting privacy, always concluding with apparent distress. Poirot contrived to observe one such conversation, and caught fragments of Lady Pemberton's voice through the study door. "I cannot. You must understand, it is impossible. No, I will not. You are being unreasonable. I cannot betray him, not even in death." Hanging up the telephone with an apparent gesture of frustration, Lady Pemberton emerged from the study to find Poirot regarding her thoughtfully. "A difficult telephone call, madame?" he ventured politely. Lady Pemberton's composure fractured momentarily. "A matter of no importance, Monsieur Poirot. A misunderstanding regarding some household accounts." But her hands trembled as she spoke, and her eyes avoided his gaze. The most significant development came during Poirot's interview with Eleanor Ashford. The housekeeper had proven consistently factual in her statements, meticulous in her recounting of the household's movements and procedures. Yet when Poirot asked her directly about her relationship to Henry Ashford, her composure shifted noticeably. "Henry is a distant cousin," she said carefully. "My late sister's boy. He has had difficulties." "Difficulties of a financial nature?" Poirot asked delicately. Eleanor Ashford's jaw tightened. "That is a matter between Henry and his creditors." Yet Lord Pemberton knew of these difficulties, did he not? And he disapproved of Miss Margaret's engagement to young Mr. Ashford. Lord Pemberton was a man of principle, Eleanor said quietly. He believed in maintaining standards. He did not approve of profligacy or moral laxity. "And does this knowledge distress you, that your family's reputation through Henry was judged inadequate by your employer? I am a professional servant, Monsieur Poirot. My family's affairs are not my concern during my hours of employment." Yet her voice had become tight, and Poirot observed her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap, a revelation of the anxiety she attempted to conceal. On the 6th day following Lord Pemberton's death, Poirot received a telegram from Dr. Hartwell, the local physician. The chemist's analysis of the poison had been completed. Lord Pemberton had been killed by cyanide salt, likely administered through the milk in his tea. A relatively small quantity had sufficed, disguised by the sweetness of milk and sugar. Cyanide salt was not, Poirot reflected, the choice of an impulsive murderer. It was deliberate, clinical, the selection of someone methodical in their intentions. That evening, Poirot attended a small dinner at the Manor, invited by Lady Pemberton in what appeared to be an attempt to demonstrate the household's normalcy. Present were Lady Pemberton, Margaret, Mr. Hartley the solicitor, and surprisingly, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, unusual as servants were generally not invited to formal dinners except in extraordinary circumstances. The tension around the table was almost palpable. Conversation was stilted, touching upon topics of weather, gardening, and other trivialities. Yet beneath these mundane exchanges, Poirot detected currents of profound anxiety. Toward the conclusion of dinner, Mr. Hartley cleared his throat and addressed Lady Pemberton formally. "I must speak with you regarding your husband's will. The time has come when certain matters must be clarified. Lord Pemberton left instructions that they were to be communicated to you 7 days after his death." Lady Pemberton's face went quite white. "I see. There are provisions," Mr. Hartley continued with a sidelong glance at Eleanor Ashford, "that may prove unexpected. Your husband was a man of considerable moral conviction." Eleanor Ashford suddenly rose from the table. "I find I am not feeling well," she announced. "I shall retire to my room. With your permission, Lady Pemberton?" "Of course," Lady Pemberton said numbly. After Eleanor had departed, Mr. Hartley pulled an envelope from his waistcoat pocket. "Your husband's specific instructions were that this letter be delivered to you at the week's conclusion. It contains explanations regarding the alterations to his will." As Mr. Hartley presented the sealed envelope to Lady Pemberton, Poirot observed with intense interest. Here, perhaps, lay the key to understanding Lord Pemberton's knowledge and intentions. "I shall review these matters privately," Lady Pemberton said quietly, her hand trembling as she accepted the envelope. Later that evening, Poirot encountered Margaret in the Manor's hallway. The young woman had clearly been weeping. "Your mother has received difficult news," he ventured. Margaret nodded miserably. "I don't know the details, but I heard voices. My mother and Mr. Hartley. She seemed angry and shocked." "What a curious combination," Poirot observed thoughtfully. "Tell me, Miss Pemberton, what do you believe your father discovered in these final weeks of his life? What knowledge was so profound as to alter his will and precipitate his attempts at justice?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke with apparent reluctance. "I believe my father discovered something about one of our household. Something shameful. I overheard him speaking with Mother. He said, 'She cannot remain in this house knowing what I know.' But he was concerned about the legal consequences of action." Poirot pressed. "Your father used the masculine pronoun?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "He was discussing a man. I assumed it was Henry, but—" The evening concluded without further revelation. Yet Poirot retired to his room at the Crown Inn with a sharpened sense of urgency. The tensions that had been building now threatened to rupture into violence. He was certain of it. The psychological pressure on those bound by Lord Pemberton's knowledge was building toward an inevitable crux. The murderer had acted once, driven by some perceived imperative of justice. It was inevitable that they would be compelled to act again. The only question remaining was who would be the next to fall. The morning of the 7th day broke dark and threatening. Rain fell in sheets, and the wind howled through Ashford's ancient streets with malevolent force. It was a day that seemed to presage misfortune, and indeed, misfortune was not long in arriving. At approximately 9 o'clock, a motorcar drew up before the Crown Inn with unusual urgency. A young constable emerged, wet and agitated, requesting Monsieur Poirot's immediate presence at Ashford Manor. "There's been another incident, sir," the constable said. "A gentleman has been taken ill. The family fears. The gentleman, is it Mr. Hartley?" Poirot asked sharply. The constable looked startled. "Yes, sir. However did you know?" "Because the pattern demands it," Poirot replied grimly, already gathering his coat. Mr. Hartley lay in the Manor's guest bedroom, attended by Dr. Hartwell and a very distraught Lady Pemberton. The solicitor was conscious, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his skin bore a pronounced pallor. The smell, that distinctive faintly almond scent, was unmistakable even to Poirot entering the room. "Poison?" he asked Dr. Hartwell quietly. "Undoubtedly," the physician confirmed. "And if the progression is consistent with Lord Pemberton's case, I fear Mr. Hartley has perhaps 2 hours, perhaps less. The dose appears to have been more substantial. How was the poison administered?" Poirot demanded. "He took breakfast in his room this morning," Lady Pemberton said, her voice shaking. "Toast, eggs and tea, a simple breakfast. He had been advised to remain here to oversee certain estate matters." "The tea," Poirot said. Again the tea. Where is the service? Servants were dispatched, and the breakfast service was located in Mr. Hartley's room. The teapot contained liquid of faint discoloration, and the residue in the cup was unmistakable evidence of poison. Yet the toast, eggs, and other items were untouched. Poirot examined the room with minute attention. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The door had been open. Mr. Hartley's own statement confirmed that the maid had entered freely in the morning to prepare the fire. Yet the poisoned tea specifically bore the marks of contamination. Who had access to the kitchen this morning? Poirot asked urgently. Everyone, Dr. Hartwell said. The household is in considerable commotion. Following the reading of Lord Pemberton's will yesterday, the staff has been in turmoil. Several servants have threatened resignation. The will, Poirot said, turning sharply to Lady Pemberton. What did your husband stipulate? Lady Pemberton clutched the letter she had received the previous evening. Her hands shook as she extended it toward Poirot. The letter, written in Lord Pemberton's own careful hand and dated nearly a month prior, contained revelations of profound consequence. To my beloved wife, I have discovered a deception so profound as to shake the very foundations of my family's honor. It is a matter I have struggled with extensively before, determining upon the following course of action. Through investigation and correspondence with certain parties in London, I have ascertained that Eleanor Ashford is not, in fact, the widow of my brother-in-law, but rather the half-sister of Henry Ashford. More significantly, she has lived in our household under false pretenses, having been engaged by my wife through a misunderstanding regarding her background. She is not a woman of the respectable widowhood she has claimed, but rather a woman with a criminal record of fraud and embezzlement charges, from which she was allowed to escape through the intervention of a solicitor now deceased, who was apparently party to her deceptions. She has been living in our household for 20 years, earning wages under false credentials. More troublingly, my investigations have revealed that she assisted her nephew, Henry Ashford, in perpetrating a fraud upon a merchant in the city, resulting in that merchant's financial ruin. Henry Ashford's present debts are substantial, and Eleanor has been secretly providing him assistance through misappropriation of household funds. I have confronted Eleanor regarding these matters, and she has admitted to them, claiming she has reformed and begging that I permit her to resign quietly without public disclosure of her past. However, my investigation further revealed that the merchant whom Henry Ashford defrauded was, until his recent death, the father of a young woman. This young woman, innocent of any wrongdoing, was left destitute by her father's financial collapse. She became a servant, contracted tuberculosis, and died in poverty 6 months ago. I am therefore resolved to ensure that justice is pursued through proper legal channels, beginning with the disclosure of Eleanor's criminal past to the authorities, and continuing with the prosecution of Henry Ashford for fraud. The resulting scandal will be severe and will touch our family, but justice cannot be sacrificed for propriety. I have therefore altered my will to establish a trust for the benefit of certain injured parties, specifically for the education and future security of the daughter of the aforementioned young woman. Additionally, I have established a fund for the benefit of Margaret, should she choose to distance herself from Henry Ashford, with an allowance contingent upon that condition. This course troubles my conscience, but I am convinced of its righteousness. I ask your forgiveness for the pain this will cause our household. Your devoted husband, Charles Pemberton. The letter concluded with detailed instructions to Mr. Hartley regarding the execution of these provisions. Poirot read the letter twice through, comprehending now the full tragedy that had driven Lord Pemberton to his moral crisis and to his death. Eleanor Ashford knew that her past was being exposed, Poirot said quietly. She knew that prosecution was imminent. Mr. Hartley, as solicitor, was integral to the execution of Lord Pemberton's justice. Thus he too became a target. But how did she administer the poison? Lady Pemberton asked desperately. She was nowhere near the breakfast service, was she not? Poirot turned to the maid who had prepared Mr. Hartley's tea. Tell me, the milk for Mr. Hartley's breakfast, where did it come from? The pantry, sir, the maid said. We have a milk jug that is kept there, separate from the dining room service. And who, among the household staff, has unrestricted access to the pantry throughout the day? The housekeeper, sir. And the maid did not finish, for at that moment Constable Whitmore appeared in the doorway with urgent news. Eleanor Ashford was missing from her room. A bag containing some of her belongings had been hastily packed and left on her bed. It was believed she had fled during the early morning hours. Dr. Hartwell administered what palliatives he could, and Mr. Hartley slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing becoming increasingly laboured. By 11:30, the solicitor was dead, victim to the same poison that had claimed Lord Pemberton. 2 murders, 2 victims connected to the exposure of Eleanor Ashford's past deceptions, and Eleanor herself now a fugitive. She will flee to London, Japp said grimly, having been summoned urgently from the station. We shall have alerts at every station and thoroughfare. She will not flee to London, Poirot replied quietly. A woman who has deceived consistently throughout her life will not abandon that pattern now. Rather, she will do the very thing that seems most improbable, the thing that would seem to place her beyond suspicion. What do you mean? Japp demanded. I mean, Poirot said, that Eleanor Ashford will remain in Ashford. She will seek shelter in the very place she believes we least expect to find her. We must act quickly but thoughtfully. Our quarry is cornered, and a cornered animal is most dangerous. At this very moment, in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, Eleanor Ashford was indeed engaged in a crucial decision. The Morning Post had brought a letter bearing London postage and handwriting she recognised. She opened it with trembling hands to read words that seemed to pronounce her doom. Eleanor, I know what you have done. I have deduced the truth regarding your role in my father's death, and have informed Monsieur Poirot. You cannot escape now. What follows will be of your own making. Margaret Pemberton. Eleanor's face went quite pale. Margaret, that girl whom she had thought so harmless, so absorbed in her own sorrows. The girl had somehow discovered the truth. She could remain here no longer. She had perhaps a few hours before Poirot and his men would think to search thoroughly. Her plan had been to allow suspicion to fall upon Henry, to suggest that he had poisoned his uncle, to ensure his inheritance from a grateful Margaret. Instead, everything had unravelled. She gathered a small bag of necessities and departed her cottage, moving through the storm-shrouded countryside with urgent determination. What she did not realize was that Hercule Poirot had already anticipated her precise pattern of reasoning. As Mr. Hartley's body was being removed from the manor and the household descended into chaos, Poirot requested a private conference with Japp in the study. Before we proceed further, Poirot said, producing Lord Pemberton's journal and the solicitor's letter, you must understand the fundamental psychology that governs this crime. We are not dealing with a criminal driven by passion or impulse. We are dealing with a woman of considerable intellect who has constructed an entire false identity across 20 years of meticulous deception. Eleanor Ashford, Japp confirmed grimly. Eleanor Ashford, Poirot agreed. But we must understand her completely if we are to predict her actions. Observe the pattern. She has spent 2 decades as a housekeeper in a respectable household, earning modest wages while secretly assisting her nephew in his fraud. To the household she is quiet, efficient, almost invisible. She is the sort of servant one overlooks precisely because of her competence. You're suggesting she has constructed a psychological camouflage? Japp asked. Precisely, Poirot confirmed. A person who can maintain such a deception for so long has developed an extraordinary capacity for self-control and strategic thinking. She did not panic when Lord Pemberton confronted her regarding her past. She thought. She considered her options, and she determined that the most effective course was to eliminate those who could expose her. Poirot rose and moved to the fireplace, his expression thoughtful. Consider the method, he continued. Not poison chosen at random, but poison administered through a medium that was already established in the victim's routine. Lord Pemberton took tea at precisely 5 o'clock daily, a schedule Eleanor would have observed for 20 years. She poisoned the milk jug, knowing he would add milk to his tea, knowing the poison would be thoroughly disguised. And for Mr. Hartley, she employed the identical method, poisoning the milk that she knew would be used for his breakfast tea. But surely such a method leaves traces, Japp protested. Someone must have observed her near the milk jug. Does anyone observe the housekeeper? Poirot replied gently. A woman whose function is to be unobserved? She moves through a household with the invisibility that her role affords. When did any servant last truly observe Eleanor Ashford's precise movements? She was part of the infrastructure, like the walls themselves. Poirot retrieved a small notebook from his pocket. I have interviewed every member of the household staff. Each has confirmed that Eleanor's movements on the day of Lord Pemberton's death were not scrutinized. She moved between kitchen, pantry, study, and upper floors without anyone specifically noting her actions. In a household of perhaps 10 servants, all occupied with their own duties, who would note the movements of the woman who had been present for 20 years? And the initials on the note? Japp pressed. A.R. Eleanor Ashford fits the initials, but it seems an odd signature for a murderer to leave. Not odd, Poirot disagreed gently. Deliberate. Eleanor Ashford was asserting her identity through that note. You see, Inspector, having hidden herself for 20 years behind a false persona, she suddenly required the world to know that her crimes were deliberate, calculated, driven by principle. The note was her assertion of agency. Yes, I did this. I, Eleanor Ashford, determined this to be justice. Yet she could not use her full name, Japp asked, because she still, even now, maintains elements of her deception, Poirot explained. The initials allow her to claim responsibility while maintaining the ambiguity that has been her psychological refuge. It is a contradiction within her mind, yes, but humans are capable of maintaining such contradictions indefinitely. Poirot paced the study slowly, his fingers forming that precise pyramid beneath his chin that Japp had come to recognize as indicating deep concentration. What Eleanor Ashford did not anticipate, Poirot continued, is that the pattern would become immediately apparent to those who understand the psychology of crime. 2 murders by poison, both administered through the same method, both targeting individuals who possessed knowledge of her deceptions. The pattern itself becomes the condemnation. Then how do we locate her? Japp asked. She has perhaps a 6-hour advantage on us. By understanding her psychology completely, Poirot replied. Eleanor Ashford has lived for 2 decades in this household. She has built a life, modest though it may be, within this community. Would such a woman easily abandon it? Would she immediately flee to London, where she would be a stranger with no resources, no identity, no refuge? She might have no choice, Japp pointed out. Precisely the opposite, Poirot corrected. She has no choice but to remain. Her entire psychological structure is rooted in Ashford. Her established patterns, her daily routines, her understanding of the social landscape, all are centered here. To flee would be to lose every anchor to identity. A person of Eleanor's psychology cannot easily make such a transition. Poirot turned to Japp with sharp intensity. She will seek shelter in Ashford. She will hide herself somewhere nearby, somewhere that offers temporary refuge, but maintains her psychological connection to the community, a place where she is not known, or where she might blend in through strategic deception. There are a dozen cottages, small properties, Japp began. Not a cottage, Poirot interrupted, because she understands that a cottage would be the first place we would search. She will do the precisely unexpected thing. She will place herself where she believes we will not think to search, because it would seem most unlikely. Poirot moved to the manor's windows, gazing out upon the rain-soaked grounds and the misty village beyond. Tell me, Inspector, is there anywhere in this village that is public, visible to all, yet remains somehow private? Somewhere a person might hide precisely because hiding there seems impossible? Japp thought for a moment. The railway station, he suggested. Visible to all, yet travellers are always passing through. The railway station, Poirot confirmed. Precisely. Eleanor Ashford has observed the railway station for 20 years. She knows its rhythms, its patterns, its hiding places. She will go there, believing that in such a public place, seeming to be merely a woman waiting for a train, she will remain invisible. She will purchase a ticket to somewhere, anywhere. And in the apparent act of fleeing, she will actually be hiding in plain sight. Within the hour, Poirot and Japp had arrived at Ashford Station with several constables. The station master, a conscientious man named Wiggins, confirmed that a woman resembling Eleanor, Ashford's description, had purchased a ticket to London, approximately 40 minutes earlier, but I am not convinced. She boarded the train, Poirot said quietly. Show me the station master's quarters, if you please. The station master's office was a modest space, containing a desk, several filing cabinets, and a small back room that the station master used for storing equipment and taking respite from his duties. It was in the back room, concealed behind a large trunk of signal equipment, that they found her. Eleanor Ashford had concealed herself there after purchasing the ticket, intending to wait until evening when the shift changed and a new station master came on duty. She had purchased the ticket precisely to create the impression she had fled, knowing that it would be several hours before the London train's arrival could be verified, several hours during which she would remain, safely hidden. It was a strategy of the highest cunning, and it would have succeeded but for Poirot's understanding of the psychology that would have motivated such deception. When discovered, Eleanor Ashford did not resist or display panic. She emerged from behind the trunk with composed dignity, her hands visible, her demeanour almost serene. "You are under arrest," Japp said, gesturing to the constables, "for the murders of Lord Charles Pemberton and Mr. Augustus Hartley." Eleanor Ashford met Poirot's gaze with an expression that was almost unreadable. "You are very clever, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "I did not anticipate your level of perception." "On the contrary," Poirot replied gently, "I anticipated precisely what your psychology would necessitate. You have lived for 20 years in a state of psychological compartmentalization, maintaining a false identity while simultaneously concealing a true one. The strain of this must have been profound." "It was," Eleanor acknowledged. When Lord Pemberton discovered the truth, when he determined to expose my past and prosecute my nephew, I understood that everything I had constructed would be destroyed, not merely my position, but my entire existence, the careful world I had built. And so you chose to eliminate those who would dismantle it, Poirot said without judgment. A rational choice by your logic, though of course an immoral one. Was it immoral? Eleanor asked quietly. That young woman whose father was destroyed by Henry's fraud, was not she an innocent victim? Did she not deserve justice? And yet her father, broken and destitute, took his own life. No one prosecuted Henry. No one ensured that he faced consequences. The world permitted wrong to flourish. When I saw the opportunity to correct that injustice, could I permit it to pass? By murdering 2 innocent men? Japp demanded angrily. Innocent! Eleanor turned her gaze to the inspector. Lord Pemberton was determined to expose me, yes, but only because his self-righteousness demanded it. And Mr. Hartley, he was simply a functionary of that same self-righteousness. They were not innocent, Inspector. They were instruments of hypocrisy. Poirot regarded Eleanor Ashford with profound sadness. And that is where your logic fails, madam. You have committed the very crime you sought to condemn. You have destroyed innocent lives in service to your own conception of justice. In doing so, you have become precisely what you condemned. As the constables led Eleanor away, Poirot remained in the small office, contemplating the tragedy of it all, the collision of righteousness and wrong, the impossibility of correcting past injustices through present crimes, the fundamental weakness in human nature that compels good and bad alike toward destruction. Over the following days, as Eleanor Ashford was held in custody pending trial, Poirot conducted a final series of interviews designed to illuminate the complete truth of the matter. He met first with Margaret Pemberton in the Manor's library. The young woman was considerably calmer now that Eleanor's guilt had been established, though her face bore the marks of profound psychological strain. "The letter I sent to Eleanor," Margaret explained, "was based on observations I had made over several weeks. I had begun to suspect that someone in the household bore us ill will. I noticed Eleanor's attention to my father's routines, her careful observation of when he took tea. I noticed how she seemed to listen at doors when my father and mother discussed the will, and I realized eventually that Eleanor must have had a motive. That whatever discovery my father had made regarding her must have been catastrophic. Yet you did not share these suspicions with your father?" Poirot asked gently. "I was not certain," Margaret said, "and my father was already distressed by what he had learned. I did not wish to compound his troubles. Instead, I hoped to gather sufficient evidence to present to you or to Inspector Japp. The letter to Eleanor was my attempt to provoke a reaction that might reveal her guilt." "A dangerous strategy," Poirot observed. "You were, in effect, placing yourself in jeopardy." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded, "but I felt I owed my father that effort. He died attempting to achieve justice for an innocent victim. The least I could do was assist in exposing his murderer." Poirot then consulted extensively with Dr. Hartwell regarding the traces of poison and the medical facts of the case. The physician confirmed that cyanide salt, when properly concealed, could remain undetected in milk for hours. The addition of sugar would mask any taste, and the poison's effects would be rapid once the tea was consumed. "A methodical murder," Dr. Hartwell agreed. "Not a crime of passion, but of calculated deliberation." Most significantly, Poirot interviewed Eleanor Ashford one final time in her cell. She seemed composed, almost resigned to her fate. "I wish to understand one matter," Poirot said. "When Lord Pemberton first confronted you regarding your past, Why did you not flee immediately? Why did you remain in the household for an additional week before administering the poison?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment. "Because I did not wish to admit that my life was finished," she said finally. "I had constructed a world here, a place where I belonged. The moment I fled, I would acknowledge that all of it was built on lies. I could not bear to relinquish that world immediately. I needed time to accept that it must be destroyed, that I must destroy it myself rather than permit others to do so." "A moment of weakness?" Poirot suggested. "A moment of humanity," Eleanor corrected. "I have spent 20 years denying my humanity. The irony is that in finally asserting it, in finally choosing to act rather than passively accept, I only confirm the criminality that my careful deception was designed to conceal." "Do you express remorse for your actions?" Poirot asked. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "For the deaths of Lord Pemberton and Mr. Hartley? No, Monsieur Poirot. I regret that I felt compelled to resort to such measures. I regret that the world does not distribute justice evenly, that good intentions and self-righteousness sometimes masquerade as morality. But I do not regret the actions themselves. They were, given my circumstances, rational choices." "And that," Poirot said sadly, "is perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case. You have rationalized your crimes to the point where remorse is impossible. You will go to trial, face conviction, and perhaps spend the remainder of your life in confinement. Yet you will do so without the psychological catharsis of genuine remorse." "Would you prefer I lie?" Eleanor asked with a slight smile. "Proclaim false regret to satisfy your moral sensibilities? I have lived in lies for 20 years, Monsieur Poirot. I will not conclude my life by returning to them." The climax of this case came not in Eleanor Ashford's trial, which proceeded along predictable legal channels, but rather in a final gathering in the Manor's drawing-room, where Poirot assembled the principal parties for a complete exposition of the crimes and their motivations. Present were Lady Pemberton, Margaret, Inspector Japp, Mr. Hartley's replacement as solicitor, and various staff members. Poirot stood before them with the bearing of a conductor about to commence a symphony. Deliberate, commanding, possessed of perfect authority. "We are gathered," Poirot began, "to discuss a matter of considerable complexity. The murders of Lord Charles Pemberton and Mr. Augustus Hartley, both committed by one person acting from motives that were, in her own estimation, fundamentally just. But before we address the murderer's psychology, we must first understand how we arrived at understanding her guilt." Poirot began his exposition methodically, tracing the pattern of evidence. First, the poison, cyanide salt, was administered through the milk in the tea service. This was no random choice, but rather a deliberate selection based on intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. Only someone who had observed Lord Pemberton's daily routines for years would possess such knowledge. Second, the method of administration was nearly identical in both murders. This suggests not an improvised criminal, but one of premeditation and calculation. The same person who murdered Lord Pemberton would naturally employ the identical method for a second victim. Third, both victims possessed knowledge that would lead to Eleanor Ashford's exposure. Lord Pemberton had discovered her criminal past. Mr. Hartley was integral to the legal processes that would prosecute her and her nephew. The logical connection is inescapable. Fourth, the note left at the crime scene. Payment for sins. The first account is settled, contains the initials AR. Eleanor Ashford fit these initials perfectly. The message itself was a signature, a claiming of agency by one who had lived for 2 decades in invisibility. Poirot paused, surveying his audience. But the crucial insight, he continued, concerned Eleanor's psychology. A woman who can maintain a false identity for 20 years is not driven by passion or spontaneous violence. She is driven by careful calculation and strategic thinking. When she comprehended that her world was threatened with destruction, she did not flee in panic. Instead, she thought carefully about how to preserve that world through the elimination of its destroyers. She recognized that the household itself, her position within it, was an anchor to her identity. Fleeing would have been to abandon that anchor. Instead, she chose to eliminate the threats to that anchor, a logical choice within the framework of her distorted moral reasoning. Poirot then walked through the specific evidence. The burns in the fireplace revealing destroyed correspondence, the journal entries revealing Lord Pemberton's moral struggle, the altered will, the financial records showing Eleanor's provision of funds to Henry Ashford, and most crucially, the testimony of servants regarding Eleanor's access to the milk jug and her movements on both days of the murders. When Eleanor Ashford fled, Poirot explained, she did not flee far. She purchased a ticket to London to create the impression of distant flight, but her psychology would not permit her to abandon her anchoring location. She concealed herself at the railway station in plain sight, believing that the very audacity of remaining in a public place would shield her from observation. This revealed the fundamental contradiction within her psyche. She had lived in concealment for 20 years, yet when finally discovered, she could not bear to be truly hidden. She required the external world to acknowledge her guilt, even as she attempted to escape its consequences. It is a contradiction that will, I suspect, haunt her for whatever remainder of her life she shall have. As Poirot concluded his exposition, Eleanor Ashford herself was brought into the room, a final element designed by Poirot to create a confrontation between her calculated crimes and their unravelling. "You have constructed," Poirot said directly to Eleanor, "a narrative in which you are an agent of justice, correcting wrongs that the world refused to address. And there is truth in your perceptions. Henry Ashford did perpetrate a fraud that destroyed an innocent family. That young woman did die in poverty and pain. Those are facts that cannot be disputed. Yet you made a fundamental error. You assumed that you possessed the moral authority to determine punishment. You assumed that your sense of justice superseded the law and the legitimate authority of society. In that assumption, you committed the very crime you condemned. You decided that certain individuals deserved to die, and you executed that judgment without trial, without due process, without the possibility of forgiveness or redemption." Eleanor remained silent, her face composed. "You are," Poirot concluded quietly, "a woman of considerable intellect and determination. In another circumstance, with different choices early in your life, you might have been a force for genuine good. Instead, you have become an instrument of death. And in doing so, you have proven that the system of law and justice, imperfect though it may be, remains superior to the justice of the individual conscience acting in isolation." The legal conclusion of the case proceeded with Victorian efficiency. Eleanor Ashford was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Her final letter, written before her execution, expressed no remorse, but rather a defiant assertion of the righteousness of her actions. Henry Ashford, facing his own legal consequences, finally admitted to the fraud that had destroyed the young woman's father. He was convicted and imprisoned, his life following a trajectory of increasing degradation. A slower death than the gallows, but death nonetheless. The Pemberton household gradually returned to normalcy, though marked forever by the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Lady Pemberton eventually entered a period of retirement, living quietly in a cottage in Sussex. Margaret, freed from her father's opposition, did not marry Henry Ashford. His criminal conviction had rendered such a union impossible. Instead, she eventually married a gentleman of respectable character and modest means, finding in that union a happiness that seemed to honour her father's memory by transcending the material considerations he had opposed. Mr. Hartley's replacement, a younger solicitor named Pritchett, ensured that Lord Pemberton's final wishes were meticulously executed. The trust established for the injured parties was properly funded, and several young people who would otherwise have faced penury were provided with educational opportunities and economic security. The household staff at Ashford Manor gradually departed or were replaced. Eleanor's position was eventually filled by a housekeeper of unquestionable reputation, and the manor itself seemed to shed the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized it during Eleanor's tenure. 6 months after Eleanor Ashford's execution, Hercule Poirot found himself once more in the village of Ashford, attending the dedication of a small library established in Lord Pemberton's name. The dedication was attended by local dignitaries, members of the Pemberton family, and many of the young people whose educational opportunities had been funded through the trust. Among these young people was the granddaughter of the merchant whose fraud had set this entire tragedy in motion. She was a promising student of 18, preparing to study medicine at a women's college, a career path that her grandfather would never have anticipated for a young woman, but which represented genuine possibility in a changing world. As Poirot stood in the library, observing the ceremony and reflecting upon the circuitous path by which justice had ultimately, imperfectly, been served, he was approached by Margaret Pemberton. "I wanted to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "for bringing Eleanor's guilt to light, and also for helping me understand my father's motivations. He was not a perfect man. His sense of justice was sometimes too rigid, his willingness to impose his moral judgments perhaps too absolute. But his fundamental intention, to correct injustice, was noble." "Your father," Poirot replied thoughtfully, "embodied a common human contradiction. He was simultaneously righteous and limited in his understanding. He possessed the moral courage to act upon principle, yet perhaps insufficient wisdom to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. It is a contradiction that exists within many of us, madam. We believe we are serving justice when often we serve only our own conception of morality." "And Eleanor?" Margaret asked quietly. "Did she serve justice, or merely her own distorted conception of it?" "She served her own conception," Poirot answered, "which is precisely why her actions were murders, not justifiable homicides. The distinction lies not in the deed itself, but in the authority by which the deed is committed. Eleanor Ashford was not a judge or a lawful authority. She was a private citizen acting upon private grievance. That transforms her actions from justice into crime." That evening, as Poirot prepared to depart Ashford and return to London, he found himself once more in the study of Ashford Manor, the very room in which Lord Pemberton had died. The room had been redecorated, the dark leather chair removed, new furniture arranged with deliberate attempt to dispel the atmosphere of death that had once characterized the space. Yet Poirot seemed to perceive layers of history beneath the cheerful present. He saw Lord Pemberton as he had been, a man burdened with knowledge of injustice, struggling to determine the proper moral response. He saw Eleanor Ashford moving through the household with her invisible competence, harbouring resentment and rage beneath her professional demeanour. He saw Mr. Hartley, an innocent functionary caught between compassion and duty. The little grey cells, Poirot murmured to himself, employing his characteristic phrase for his own mental processes, have worked themselves into understanding. Yet understanding does not absolve us of the fundamental tragedy that human nature creates. We are creatures of limited perspective, of incomplete knowledge, of moral conviction that often exceeds our wisdom. We commit injustices in the service of justice. We protect ourselves through deceptions that ultimately imprison us. We convince ourselves that our vengeance is righteousness, that our revenge is correction. He paused, his reflection contemplative. And the law, imperfect as it may be, remains the only adequate framework for addressing human wrongdoing. For when the individual conscience becomes the arbiter of justice, we risk creating precisely what Eleanor Ashford created. Additional death in the service of past death. Additional wrong in the attempted correction of previous wrongs. The following morning, Poirot departed Ashford by the same route he had arrived. The train pulled away from the small station with its accustomed efficiency, and the village receded behind him. Peaceful once more, serene once more, its ancient tranquillity apparently restored. Yet in the church records, in the legal documents, in the new library and its collection of books donated by Lord Pemberton's estate, the traces of the tragedy remained. Years hence, the village would speak of the murders with a mixture of fascination and horror, would point out the manner and recount the details of the crimes, would render the events almost legendary in their retelling. But the deeper lessons, the understanding that moral certainty often masks moral arrogance, that justice pursued without due process becomes revenge, that the law, however imperfect, provides necessary constraint upon individual conscience. These lessons remained largely unlearned, and in London, Hercule Poirot settled into his rooms, resumed his practice of solving the mysteries that came before him, and continued his observation of human nature in all its contradictory complexity. The case of Ashford Manor was closed. The murders had been solved, the guilty punished, the innocent partially vindicated. Yet the fundamental questions that the case had raised, questions regarding the nature of justice, the limits of individual moral authority, the proper relationship between law and conscience, remained open. They were questions, Poirot reflected, that humanity would never fully answer, for they struck at the very heart of what it meant to be human, imperfect, limited, yet possessed of the capacity for both great good and profound evil. It was this complexity, this tragic beauty of human contradiction, that made the study of crime not merely an intellectual puzzle, but a profound meditation on human nature itself. And with that thought, Hercule Poirot returned to his methodical routines, his precise processes, his careful observation of the little details that revealed the great truths of human behavior. The little grey cells continued their work, as they always would, probing the mysteries of human motivation, the patterns of crime, the revealed truth that lay beneath the surface of apparent innocence.